Hi. I'll actually just start by documenting this. So if you could just, wait, oh, there's a lamp there. Let's cover the lamp with a hand. No, that's, there we go. And my arm is going to be in the picture. That's bad. We'll just do, I don't know. Okay, now, everybody wave. Thank you. And hello. My name is Johan Öbrink. I work for a company called iTeam as a digital strategist. And we build all sorts of stuff, basically solving problems with technology. The talk that I'm giving today was initially, the first time I gave it was in Swedish, and it was called Köp grisen i säcken. Because there's a Swedish saying that you should never buy a pig unseen, so basically reverse it and say that you should. And then I translated it to English, and it got the very short and succinct name, Why Promising Nothing Delivers More and Planning Always Fails. The origin of this talk was actually me trying to answer a question, which was this. Why do so many IT projects fail? I'm guessing there are some of you in this room who've experienced a failed IT project at some point in your career. There's a funny picture that's been going around the internet for quite a while. A lot of you have seen it. And it sort of falls into the category of it's funny because it's true. So I don't know if you all can see it, but it says, basically the pictures are saying how the customer explained it, how the project leader understood it, how the engineer designed it, how the programmer wrote it, how the sales executive described it, how the project was documented, what operations installed, how the customer was billed, how the help desk supported it, and finally, what the customer really needed. I sort of looked at this picture for a while, and I was like, there has to be information in this. Because since it's the kind of funny because it's true type of joke, this is something that we recognize, which means that it's something that's happening repeatedly. There must be information in there. So this is what I'm going to try to explain. And in order to do that, I think we'll need to take a step back and go back in time and do this by giving a short history of the corporate web. Now, it actually all started pretty simple. This was basically it. A web was a place where you said, it was basically a sign saying, we have these products, they are good because of this, they cost this much, now come and buy. And that was all it was. It was a sign. But then, of course, we evolved. So we started doing the same thing, but now with Flash. Whereas if you look at the corporate web today, it looks more something like this. So it's basically, it's like every part of the company is represented in this system. You have the like the annual reports, you have the products, you have the shopping cart, you have customer support, everything is there. And what happens when you sort of cram all these things together is that you end up with complexity. And of course, you realize that complexity leads to risk. Now, risk leads to risk management, and as you all know, risk management leads to suffering. But why is that? Well, if we just look at how we usually manage risk, what we do is this. We try to get rid of it using a sort of deceptively simple solution. What we do is that first we define what we're trying to do, like really, really well. Then we go through and estimate every part of that definition. And then, since we're not idiots, we've been doing this before, we realize that that definition is probably not complete. There are going to be some unknowns in there, so we try to estimate those as well. And so now we can use this to negotiate a contract. And as soon as the contract is signed, we basically sort of packaged the risk and shipped it off. So we end up with this, the iron triangle, with a fixed budget, a fixed time, and a fixed scope. And hopefully somewhere in there we have some sort of quality. That's usually not defined, though. And then, inevitably over time, the scope grows. And the only thing that can give now is the quality, because we fixed all the others. So quality suffers from this. But does it really have to be that way? Well, as it turns out, it actually does. There is no way out of this, because if we look at the risk allocation of this, so we had the risk, okay? We tried to get rid of the risk, but what we've actually ended up doing is that we've distributed the risk. So we distributed over two parts. We have the party of the client, and we have the party of the contractor. This is actually the same in large organizations where they have their own IT department, because they still function as separate units. So it could be like business and IT, or a client and a contractor. And we're basically dealing with two sorts of risk. So we have the economic risk, which is basically that the project goes over budget. And then we have the functional risk, which is something like, well, basically it doesn't work. So the interesting thing with risk is that depending on where you place it, it can have different prices. So if we look at the prices of risk for these two parties, it's actually not symmetrical. The contractor is usually more exposed to economic risk than the client. This is also true for IT. If you look at the biggest banks in Sweden, their IT is actually the only unit that they call a cost unit. The rest of the units generate revenue, IT costs. So they are budget constrained. And if we look at the functional risk, it's really low for us, because if something doesn't work, we can always fix it. That's what we do. We're programmers, right? But for the client, it's insanely pricey. Because think of what this means. What I sort of described as functional risk is something like, oh, I don't know, the e-commerce site going down on just before Christmas. It can be insanely expensive for the client. And what we did with this contract was basically that we shipped off all the economic risk to the contractor. Yes?
Do you have the risk of going over time baked into the economic risk?
The question is the risk of going over time baked into the economic risk? It could be, but not necessarily. It could also, because going over time could actually be a functional risk as well, as in your web shop isn't up in time for Christmas. But all the economic risk is now on the contractor, and the only thing that we can do is this. We ship the functional risk over to the client. Why do we do that? Well, it's not actually malevolence, but it's one part of it is when you're trying to resolve something and you're out of money and out of time, you are very inclined to try to look through the contract and through the definitions and find where the client actually ordered the thing that doesn't work. And it's also subconscious, because if you sort of suspect that something could be not quite stable, like what happens if the user behaves really stupidly, should I go through this again? You tend to sort of push that back when you're running out of time. So it incentivizes us to lower the functionality, or lower the quality of the functionality. So that's a problem. But as it turns out, that's actually our smallest problem. Because the thing is, if you look at fixed requirements, there's a problem with them. And that is that fixed requirements lead to bad products. Why is that? Well, there's something to say for planning in advance. I mean, it can be good. But Then when it turns out that your map doesn't match reality, fixed requirements actually force you to go by the map. Which means that if we go back to this one, there is one outcome in this picture which is totally impossible. And it's that one, what the customer really needed. Why is that? Well, because that's not how they described it. They described it like this. They didn't know that this was what they needed. We could have found that out during the production of the system, but we can never deliver it if the requirements were fixed. So, okay, this all sort of makes sense, right? So how come we keep doing this even though we know it doesn't work? Well, I think it has to do with something called the streetlight effect. This is a term that's used in statistics when people look at bad data. And it's actually based on a cartoon where it comes in different flavors. There's someone that's crawling beneath a street light and looking for something. It could be a penny or his keys home or something. And someone comes and asks him, "What are you looking for?" "Well, I'm looking for this." And they start looking together. And finally the other guy says, "Are you sure you lost them here?" And he goes, "No, I lost them over there in the park." "So why are we looking here?" "Well, there is no light over there." And this is actually the problem of accuracy versus validity. You have a high level of accuracy under the street lamp, but a very, very low validity because it's not actually there that you lost the keys. And this thing fools us all the time because we focus so much on the accuracy. So we focus on stuff like the budget of a project instead of the return on investment of the project. Why? Well, because it's easy to measure budget and it's hard to measure revenue. There is no light over there. And we tend to prioritize features by cost rather than importance. Why? Because it's hard to measure importance. There is no light over there. And we prioritize quantity over quality. Again, it's easy to measure quantity. It's hard to measure quality. There is no light over there. And we try to produce stuff like the burn-up chart instead of focusing on the actual speed with which we are bringing features to our end customers, because it's harder to measure that speed. So we keep looking under the streetlight instead of looking at the numbers that actually matter. And that's why we keep failing. So, is there any way to get out of this? Well, I think there is. There is an alternative. The alternative is to try to change your KPIs to those of a startup entrepreneur. Because as it turns out, startups operate in a certain way based on the fact that their KPIs are different. So, a startup is driven by a well-defined idea, but an unclear path. That's sort of always assumed. They usually focus on building a dedicated team rather than on like who's not in a project right now. They have a huge focus on time to market because they're trying to create something new. So if they aren't first, they might not get there at all. So they have to come out fast. And since they're funded by investors or their own money, but specifically when they have investors, they need to show continuous and visible improvements. Now, we were working with a startup in Los Angeles, and they had built a system using some contractors that weren't that good, and they sort of got stuck. And they hadn't been able to release in 6 months, and we tried to help them. And after 1.5 weeks, we managed to make 2 consecutive releases in 1 day. So it was like, yes, now we can start improving again. The only problem was then that the investors had already pulled out because they hadn't seen any improvement for so long. So you need the continuous and visible improvements. And of course, the ROI always trumps the budget. Because if you invest in a high-risk opportunity, it's because you expect to make a lot of money. So you don't focus on how much it costs you, you focus on how much you can gain. Otherwise, you just put the money like in your mattress. And high risk means that failure is always an option. So these things we know. So what does this lead to? Well, one of the things it leads to is the insight that you need to focus on building a minimum viable product. Now, this is almost as popular as saying microservices, but it's really hard to get it right. So there's a picture, I think it was on Spotify, that sort of try to explain how you actually do a minimum viable product. And they say, don't do it like this. You do it like this. Because in the first case, there is no product anywhere until you reach the 4th picture. The rest of the steps are not releasable. In the second case, every step is releasable, and every new step brings some additional value. But in order to do this, you need to be really clear on what's the actual goal. Because if the actual goal is to build a car, then the second example doesn't work at all. Because the first thing was a skateboard, and then it was a scooter, and then it was a bike. Those aren't cars. So if that second example was accurate, it was actually because we were trying to build something moving people from A to B. In that case, the example works out. Because everything moves people, but by the 4th stage, you can actually bring grocery bags. And the interesting thing is when you realize what is the actual core value of the product that you're trying to create, and not just the description of the product that someone has, the core value of the product, you can start releasing early and then build it out. And the sort of ultimate value of that is that you can learn along the way. So it might be that you never ever release a car because you realize that what people actually want is a hoverboard. So your plan changes along the way because of feedback from your actual customers that you now have because you released. So this all sounds good, doesn't it? Yay, we build an MVP, and then we release, and we release, and we release again. Although, it sort of depends on how you do your releases. I was talking to a guy here at Øredev, I think it was two years ago, and he said he'd been working for, I think it was the biggest online retailer in the UK. And they released a new system for them. A new e-commerce system. And after the release, it took 11 guys. He said guys, so it was probably only guys. That happens a lot in IT. So 11 guys, 24 hours to roll it back. Because they found a bug. Now, it didn't take 11 guys 24 hours to solve the bug. It took them 24 hours to roll it back, and then they could start looking for the bug. And if you're in that situation, and someone like me comes into the room and says, hey guys, what do you say we do like a release every week? They're going to shoot me. So in order for this to work, you actually need to reach a 0 cost of release. So 0 cost means 0 time and 0 money. It just works every time. Because when there's no cost for the release, you can do it often. But the best part of this is that when you have 0 cost, it actually makes the release into a business decision instead of this sort of IT death march that it usually is. So how can we reach that point? Well, we need some stuff then. The first thing we need, of course, is continuous delivery. If we are to release all the time, we need sort of an always present artifact that we can automatically put into production. Okay? Makes sense? We have a button, released. So this is, a lot of companies want this. But what you have to realize is that this doesn't work unless you have a really good foundation of automated regression tests. Because if you are going to release that thing, you need to be able to trust it. And without automated tests, you cannot trust it. But in order for this to work, you need a good continuous integration environment. Because if all the developers are constantly working, and I mean, these automated regression tests, they should go through everything. So that's going to take some time. But the developers need to know all the time that they're not breaking each other's stuff. So we need a good continuous integration environment. And in order for that environment to work, we need a continuous and fast test runner. Because the tests need to run at my computer at all times, and I want them to complete, preferably within 300 milliseconds. Or 250, actually. And that's because 250 milliseconds is the shortest amount of time that the brain can actually detect. So if it's within 250 milliseconds, it's instant. If it's over 250, it's not instant, which means you have a waiting time. And you want this feedback to be instant. So, I've been in situations where people have asked me, like, what's most important? Is it the sort of the acceptance tests that run through the whole thing, or is it the unit tests? Well, the thing is, they're not the same. Because if you look at the top part here, that's all about building confidence. Confidence that the stuff we're putting out there is working. It doesn't matter if it takes 4 hours to run these tests. If it has to be done to reach that level of confidence, we have to do it. Whereas this bottom part is all about speed. This is about the feedback loop to the developers, so that we can keep working on stuff and know when we break it. So they serve two completely different purposes, but they're both needed. And this needs to be put in place at some point in order to create a good product, which means that some point is always on day one. Because it's going to save time throughout the whole project as long as it's there, which means that if we wait 2 months, we're just wasting time. Of course, we can always tweak it, but we need to get started immediately. So, what happens if we start doing this? Well, actually, it starts changing a few things. There's a hashtag that's been going around Twitter. It was actually a talk on this on was it yesterday or the day before that, here as well. Something called No Projects. Now, I'm not going to go into that really, but just to sort of understand why projects could be a problem, I looked up the definition of project, and I found 2 of them. The first one is from the Project Management Institute. It says it's a temporary group activity designed to produce a unique product, service, or result. Well, so it works. Although temporary seems weird, like would you actually disband the team before the project is done just because the time frame runs out? Probably not. So let's look at the second definition we have from Prince 2. A temporary organization that is needed to produce a unique and predefined outcome or result at a pre-specified time using predetermined resources, which we by now know doesn't work. So there is a problem with projects, and I've actually been asked, like, what should we call it instead? And I don't really care. I actually keep calling it projects, although it's not, because the problem is not in the word, but what we have to realize is that the tooling we have for running projects is most often wrong, because it's tailored to help you do this thing that you don't want to do. So you have to think about your tooling, you have to think about the choices you make. The other hashtag I was going to talk about is I find far more interesting, and it's this one, no estimates. This was actually a different hashtag initially. It was a hashtag called estimates are wrong. That never worked. Can anyone guess why? It's not that it was too long. It was that no one disagreed. And if no one disagrees, you can't start a movement. So they changed it to no estimates, and then all hell broke loose. People started screaming, what do you mean? What do you mean get rid of estimates? We need those estimates. I was like, well, you just said they were wrong. Yeah, but we need them. Why? Well, to plan. So you're gonna plan based on something that you know is wrong? Yeah. Why? Because it's all we have. What? Yeah, we've always done it that way, exactly. And we've always failed. So, what is no estimates then? Well, this is a slideception. This is from Øredev 2 years ago, where Duarte Vasco was talking about no estimates. So I photographed his slide, and now if you take a picture of this, you have a picture of my picture of his slide. So it basically says the how-to of no estimates. You select the most important piece of work that you need to do. Then you break that work into risk-neutral chunks. I'll return to that word later on. Risk-neutral chunks of work. You develop each piece of work, and then you iterate and refactor. That's all you do. But what is risk-neutral? Now this is really important. Risk-neutral is basically something that you are able to keep in your head all at once. So, because then you can actually predict the outcome of that. You can manage this thing. So it's usually, I don't know, somewhere between 4 hours and a day, something like that. Could be considered risk neutral. Like, I know exactly how to do this, so I can do it. So what we started doing, because we wanted to try this, was I actually found a sort of alternative poker planning set from some guys in Poland, I think it was, called Lunar Logic, that looks like this. So basically I have 3 sizes. Either it's a 1, as in it's risk neutral, or it's too fucking big, or it's you have no fucking clue. Those are the sizes. So now what we started to do was we started to looking at the first feature, the most important feature, the one we're going to build first, and we said, is this a 1? Nope, too fucking big. Okay, is there any part of this that we can sort of break out and call a 1? Not really, but I can sort of, well, this thing could maybe, nope, that's not a 1, we'll break that apart again. And so we'll sit together and we start breaking this thing apart, defining the pieces so that we understand them, and then we'd be left with like a pile of 1s and a few no fucking clues. Now the no fucking clues is what the risk is. That means that we have to sort of break off from the schedule and do some sort of spike or probe into that problem and try to see if we can gain enough understanding so that we can break it into 1s. And the work of breaking it into 1s is that's actually what's frustrated me the most during sprint plannings when you do this whole poker planning thing, is that the only thing that you aren't allowed to talk about is what the problem actually is. You're not allowed to do that breakdown. And this breakdown is actually the most valuable thing you can do. Because that's actually sitting in a room with other people with lots of brains. It's like basically doing mob programming without any keyboards. You're solving the problem in that room, and then you can go to your computer and type the code. So there's enormous value in that process. But the second thing is that when you start producing these once, you could actually measure that throughput. And if this stabilizes over time, it means that you can start making predictions. But this time, the predictions are based on actual measured data, not on some guess about something that you didn't understand, which you then measured in some stupid way. So this is actual data. And of course, the throughput is then measured, and this doesn't hold until it's actually out in production. So, how can we get here? That's the problem, right? It all sounds good, but it's hard to sell. Well, I would say that what you need is two things. It's confidence and it's collaboration. So if we look at the contractor's perspective, it's all about making sure that the customer has the confidence in us. So we need to build that trust. The first thing we do is that we make sure that the client owns the code from day one. When we get a new client, what we do is if they don't have a GitHub repo, we create a GitHub repo and we tell them to pay for it. Now they are the owners of that repo and they let us borrow the keys. That means they can kick us out at any time. Same thing with build servers. We make sure that the client owns them and they let us in. We need to make sure that there is no lock-in. What we actually did, there was one client that asked me, they were trying to sort of specify how the contract should look. And they put in this clause about features versus bugs. We'd been working with them for almost a year by then. And I said, well, the way that we are working with you, when we're constantly like coming up with new things and we're trying them out and then like scrapping the thing that doesn't work and keep building on the stuff that does work and that your customers actually like. If we're to do that, we need to start specifying in advance, which means that we're going to lose all the speed that we have. And so he says, but shouldn't the contract be written, you should work as if you were friends, and you should write a contract as if you were enemies. And I said, no, you should work as friends and write a contract as if you were friends, and when you're no longer friends, you should stop working. Because no good is going to come out of working with someone who's your enemy. So he goes, so what you mean is I should sign a really short contract? And I go, yes. And he goes, how short? And I say, well, how short do you want? You can buy it for a day. And he says, well, why should I buy it longer? Well, if you want to guarantee that we actually have any resources to give you, you book them in advance. That's it. So really short contract, let the client decide how long they want them. And total transparency. If they are to trust us, they need to have the information. Not the sugar-coated information, all the information. What we did right, what we did wrong, when we did it, how it looks. And I'm not talking about reporting. I'm talking about them being able to see it. As in, please come sit with us at our office when you want to. Can we come and sit with you at your office from time to time because we want to understand how you work? Do you feel that you know everything that's going on in the project? Otherwise, we have to improve it. Or just raising your hand and say, hey, I really screwed up. You know this thing I described to you yesterday that was so awesome? Turns out it was shit. And when you tell them that, you actually build the trust and you build the confidence, and they start viewing you as a real professional when you admit your mistakes. Of course, we need the constant and consistent quality. That's a weird thing when it comes to projects. Like, for the longer we work in a project, say I'm calling it a project, the longer we work in a project, the better we understand it, right? which means that it should be easier and easier to make changes to it over time, right? But that's not the case. Why is that? Well, because the architecture evolves. It's never specified and then you stick to it. It evolves over time. But that means that you have to go back and you have to refactor stuff and make sure that everything is in good shape. And every time you touch a piece of code, if you find something there that's not nice, you clean it up. You follow the scout principle. You always leave the camp in a better shape than you found it. And you keep doing that because that's what gives you the consistency. We need a minimal cost of entry. I did some contract work for Spotify a while ago, and it took me, I think it was 2.5 days before I could start coding, because of all the settings and configurations that had to be made and all the stuff that had to be installed and blah, 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 blah. That's not a good way to onboard people. So what we try to do is we try to actually rotate people between the different projects from time to time for 2 reasons. One of them is that it's always good to have fresh eyes on what you're doing. And the other thing is that we constantly expose ourselves to getting a new person into the code base, which means that you have to make it easy. So you should basically have a README that's like 1 screen high with all the instructions you need to go through to get the project up and running. And that's usually something in terms of npm install, docker compose build, docker compose up, you're done. That's all you should have to do. Zero cost of release, of course. And also, the minimal cost of entry, that also means that they can actually kick us out. We haven't locked them in because it's so easy for someone else to take over. So it's really important for the trust. So, from the other perspective, the client. Number 1, do not negotiate price. Just don't. It's stupid. Because the only thing that happens is that you're telling the contractor that I don't trust in, not that I don't trust you, I don't trust your competence. If we have a price, that's what we're going to have. Now we can lower prices, but that's never a negotiation. It's just that we can get paid in different ways. Like if someone books us a year in advance, that means that we don't have to do as much sales. That saves us money. That can come off the money part of the price. But don't negotiate the price, because you want to feel that you're not adversaries, you're friends. And also, if the price is that important, you probably expect quite a low return on that project. Now, we're working in a business that's capable of producing returns on orders of magnitude, which means that if your profit margin is that low, your expected profit margin is probably the wrong project, so don't do it at all. The second one is you are in control. This might sound as something that we give to the client, but it's not. It's something that we demand of the client. Because we are good at technology, we're good at programming stuff, we're good at solving technical things, but we're not good at the business of the client. If we were, we would be a product company. So we need the client there. We don't need a proxy of the client, like, oh, this is the product owner who's actually a project manager from some other company that's going to be the proxy of the users. No, the client has to be there and be the captain of the ship at all times. Sometimes they say that they can't, and again, that probably means that the project isn't very important, so it shouldn't be done. Minimum viable product. It's here because it's hard for some clients to agree on making one or what it actually is. But they have to be able to specify what's the actual value of this product, and that's what we're going to release first, and it's not going to be any more than that. They have to dare to fail. But the key word is that they have to dare to fail in time. SEB, which is one of Sweden's bigger banks, tried to rebuild their whole system a few years ago. It cost them, when they failed, they had lost, I think it was 1 billion kroner, and the write-offs were in the order of 3 billion kroner. And everyone kept talking about how great it would have been if they had succeeded. But I would say, how great would it be if they had failed for 100,000? Because the failure was always there. But they should have failed cheaper. So to sum it up, basically, fixed price projects are bad risk allocation. Fixed specifications give bad products. Focus on what matters, not what's easily measured. Release often, and release early and often and with zero cost. Don't be constrained by the project model, and don't estimate. Like really, don't. It's stupid, it costs money, and it makes the product worse. Because as soon as you've estimated something, you've actually invested in that estimation. So you're going to consciously or subconsciously try to stick to it, instead of sticking to what's the actual value. And build the confidence that you need to collaborate. I think my time is up, right? We don't need this. Boom, 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 boom. Let's go there. Hey.